Hi, I'm Liam Dan. Welcome to the Economy Hub. With me today, I have JB Weir, Head of Strategy, Bernard Doyle. And Bernard, you've put out a piece saying that New Zealand is in a productivity recession. What do you mean by that?
Well, Liam, it's when we look at GDP growth, which is still printing pretty well. We're growing at about 3% per annum. But if you look at the last 5 years, almost all of that growth has come from either more people in the country or more hours worked. We have had no contribution from GDP per hour worked. That's the most important component of growth you can have, and that's the recession we're in at the moment. That GDP per hour worked is how countries get wealthy.
Sure. Look, and this note I think has raised a few eyebrows because we've heard commentators talking about the lack of wage inflation, New Zealand's economy being flattered by immigration. But you guys have put your money where your mouth is, really. You've adjusted your equity strategy, talking about pulling back on New Zealand equities by 25%. Is it that serious? Do you see it as an issue for investors?
I think it's a big issue for the economy. It's an issue for the equity market, the share market. It's not the only issue, and it's important to acknowledge that we've had 5 years of almost 20% per annum growth in the share market. So we're not a cheap market by any stretch, and that's obviously something we factor in. And when we look at our asset allocations this year, we've started to ease back our allocation to New Zealand. But the productivity question becomes really important when you ask, where do we go from here? And the issue with having no productivity growth, where it gets an economy that's still growing its GDP due to population or more hours worked, is where do you go from here? Because we clearly have run out or are pushing against spare capacity in many industries. And as an investor, that can be a bit of an amber flag about what happens next from that. And we've already seen a glimpse of that in the construction sector, which is building houses, building infrastructure as fast as it can, but it hasn't been profitable. It's hurt profitability. And that's an indication of an economy that has, due to really a lack of productivity growth, is at the edge of its limits to generate good growth.
So you see this as quite different to a New Zealand issue, rather than there is a global discussion around, since the GFC productivity hasn't been great globally, and people are looking around at how we get wages up for ordinary workers, but you certainly see this as an acute issue for New Zealand rather than the rest of the world.
Yes. I think you're absolutely right, and certainly most advanced economies are struggling with how to grow productivity, and it's also really hard to measure. So that's important to say. But even with the margin of error, we know it's poor here. I think the wrinkle with New Zealand is the population element. We're growing our population at 2%, so that immediately brings in things like housing, infrastructure, and capacity pressure into the mix in a way that they're not really at play in Japan, Europe, and even the US to a large extent. And that capacity pressure is where it can have, for example, housing affordability has a spillover effect. And so that's how it's a little bit different for New Zealand versus the rest of the world.
Sure. Now, we don't want to be alarmist. You're not predicting a crash here exactly. I mean, we've seen the NZX follow Wall Street to record highs in the last few weeks or over a long period, really. But you think that it's not sort of a next week, next month kind of issue. It's a long-term trend.
Yes, I mean, a couple of things I'd say there. Saying reduce our allocations by a quarter sounds dramatic, but that could be taking a portfolio from 12.5% New Zealand equities to 9 or 10%. But it's important in the scheme of things. The other thing I'd say is, for New Zealand, it's not obvious to us that there's some looming cliff. It's more, when you look at the next 5 years, you say, we've grown at 3% per annum, we're pushing against capacity limits, so it's going to be very hard to continue at that growth rate. It's very hard to see how that continues. And therefore, how are we going to continue to generate the earnings growth that fuels a share market? So it's much more likely to us that we're going to have to go through a period where the share market catches up with where the economy's got to, so that says to us, low returns. And that's the biggest driver of why we've started to adjust our asset allocations.
Sure. Now, all hoping that we don't have a crash. What is a solution to this? What would be a decent way out of this scenario, do you think?
You always cross your fingers. When you're at an economy that has 90% capacity utilisation in our housing market, house prices are 6 times income, there are things that could hit us, and we could be a little bit vulnerable. But really the nicest thing here would be a nice gradual slow cooling of the economy and give sectors like the construction sector time to catch up. Longer term, I think, and it was interesting hearing Governor Wheeler yesterday, this is an under-debated area of the economy. I know economists talk about it a lot, but politically productivity growth has to be, I think, looked at far more closely. GDP growth has become increasingly an irrelevant first indicator of success. So we need to really, I think, attack what are the root causes of our underperformance here, and I think linked to that a sort of apolitical debate around what is the right rate of population growth to aspire to medium term that fits our economy is a healthy debate to have as well.